Gates Jr.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Carla, thank you so much for putting this together. This is a marvelous idea, a brilliant setting. It's just such a special event, and I want to thank you and applaud the university that had the good wisdom to hire my old friend and get her out of California and bring her back here. So, bravo to you. Let's give it up for Carla Kaplan. And it's nice to be here with Anne Fausto Sterling, who is such a good friend. We were at Bellagio together, and some of you know that Bellagio is in northern Italy, near Milano, and it's the site of the Rockefeller Foundation Center, and it just so happens that we met there. Now, it turns out that I knew Anne's mother, Dorothy Sterling, who's a great scholar in African-American history. But I didn't ever know that she had a daughter. I didn't know anything about it. So we met at Bellagio, and in 1992, and I wrote, in 6 weeks, I wrote the first draft of my memoir, Colored People. I went there for something entirely different. And if Anne and I had known then, if someone had said that this person who has a PhD in English language and literature from the University of Cambridge would, all these years later, be making documentaries for PBS and the BBC about DNA, we would have just laughed out loud. I can't quite believe it myself, but as some of you know, I've made now 3 documentary series called African American Lives, African American Lives 1, African American Lives 2, Finding Oprah's Roots, and I'm now hard at work doing a new series, which I'll talk about at the end, called Faces of America. 25 million people watched the opening night of African American Lives 1 and African American Lives 2. This is a black series on PBS. This is unheard of. And so I wanted to share with you how I backed into this marvelous world of identity politics through DNA. And it all started when I was 10 years old. I grew up in the hills of West Virginia, and my family on all sides has lived in a 30-mile radius from the town in which I was born for 200 years. I'm descended from 7 sets of free Negroes, all of whom married each other. In fact, I'm a Redmond on my father's side, and I'm a Redmond on my mother's side, which probably explains some of my more unusual personal characteristics. My grandfather, Edward St. Lawrence Gates, who was born in 1879, died in June of 1960. I was 3 months shy of my 10th birthday, and I attended his funeral, and it was the first funeral I attended for a family member. And I stood next to his casket holding my father's hand. I have one brother who's the chief of oral surgery, Bronx Lebanon Hospital. He's 5 years older than I, my mother were here. I was always the baby. And so I'm standing there holding my dad's hand. Now, my father is a very, very funny man. My father is 95 years old. He'll be 96 on June 8th. He would have been here, too, but he's on a date. So I'm sorry he couldn't come. My father's a total dog. I mean, that must be DNA, too. But my father is so funny. I'll tell you how funny my father is. When I was growing up, I wanted to be a Rhodes Scholar. Now, I'm growing up in the hills of West Virginia. When my cousins wanted to be Hank Aaron and Willie Mays, I wanted to be a Rhodes Scholar. I wanted to go to Harvard or Yale. I wanted to go to Oxford or Cambridge. So through a miracle, I go to Yale. And I do well. As my people say, I've always been blessed in the classroom. And so I applied to go to Oxford or Cambridge. I applied for a Rhodes Scholarship, a Fulbright, a Marshall, a Casby, a Mellon. Look, I was black from West Virginia. I was junior year 5'8", and I was going to graduate. I was Scholar of the House, and I was going to graduate Summa. I knew that I would even get the affirmative action Rhodes Scholarship, baby. I was going to Oxford. But I didn't get a Rhodes, I didn't get a Marshall, I didn't get a Fulbright, I didn't get any of these fellowships. So I went to my girlfriend, who's the great Linda Darling Hammond, who, as you know, is a great distinguished professor of education now at Stanford. She was my junior year love. And I said, what am I doing wrong? And she said, well, Skippy is what she called me. Skippy, you're not being yourself. So I went into the last fellowship, the Mellon Fellowship, and I was just my total self, because I figured I wasn't going to get it anyway. And to my amazement, I got this fellowship. So I ran back to Calhoun College at Yale, and I called home to Piedmont, West Virginia. And my daddy answered the phone. And at that time, remember, you didn't have 2 phones. You had a phone and an extension phone. Remember that? I don't know why, but we had an extension phone. So I said, put Mom on the extension phone. So Mom was upstairs, she got on an extension phone. I said, Mom and Daddy, you'll never believe it, you'll never believe it. I got a Mellon Fellowship, I'm the first Afro-American to get a Mellon Fellowship. I'm going to the University of Cambridge. And without missing a beat, my daddy said, you're the first Negro to get a Mellon Fellowship? I said, yeah, Daddy. He said, they're going to call it the Watermelon Fellowship. So this is why I'm so crazy, because my father is totally crazy. My father's so funny, he makes Red Fox look like an Undertaker. So we're standing at my grandfather's casket in the Kite Funeral Home in Cumberland, Maryland, and I'm holding his hand, and I look at how ridiculous my grandfather was. My grandfather looked like a white man. We called him Casper behind his back. He was so white. For Casper the Friendly Ghost. If we got caught doing that, we'd get in big trouble. So I started to laugh, because imagine if when he had blood coursing through his veins, if he looked that white. Imagine how white he looked dead and powdered. So I thought my father was laughing, and I looked up, and as I started to laugh to share the joke with my dad, my father was crying, these huge tears, and I was so embarrassed that I started to cry, and I was afraid I was going to get punished. But more than that, I was just so embarrassed that I had completely misread this poignant moment in my family's life. But nobody noticed, because everybody in the whole funeral home was so amazed that my father was crying. So we went to bury him at the Episcopal Cemetery, all-white Episcopal Cemetery in Cumberland, Maryland, and we went back to the Gates family home, which Jane Gates, who had been a slave and who had been impregnated, all of her children, by an Irishman. Jane Gates had bought 5 years out of slavery. Jane Gates was a slave until 1865. That's a slave line of the family that we could trace. And she paid cash for this house in 1870. Therein lay another story. So we go back to this house, and my father takes my brother and me upstairs to my grandparents' bedroom. We didn't even know they had an upstairs in their house. I don't know about you, but there was none of this false intimacy with your grandparents. You didn't sit on the bed, you didn't go upstairs, you didn't play that. So we go upstairs, and my father goes through this cabinet, and he pulls out all these bank ledgers. And it turns out that the bank ledgers are full of newspaper clippings, and my grandfather clipped newspapers. And he was obsessed with current events. So there are all these news clips about World War II, about, he had a mordant fascination with death. He was automobile accident, plane accident, how many people were killed, and he was also a race man. The first black person do this, first black person do this. Finally, my father stops at a picture and an obituary, and he says, this is what I wanted you boys to see. And the headline said, died this day in Cumberland, Maryland. It was January 8th, 1888. Jane Gates, an estimable colored woman. And I looked at this, and he said, this is the oldest Gates. And then he showed us her picture. And she was a midwife. And that picture, and she was in a midwifery uniform, and that picture now hangs in the kitchen of my house, right in the middle of Harvard Square. Well, the next day, I started keeping composition books, having interviewed my parents about who was this woman, when was it my grandfather who I just seen buried, when was he born, where was he born, what he did, tracing both sides of my family. I became obsessed at the age of 9 3/4 with doing my family tree. I was only on the eve of my 10th birthday. I would lose interest, I would lose the composition books, I would start all over again. Well, but I retained this interest. I used to see coats of arms advertised in the Washington Post magazine. We were very near, Piedmont, West Virginia is on the Potomac River, very near D.C. And I thought I could send away for $50 and get a Gates coat of arms, a family crest, but it wouldn't be my Gates family crest. And by the way, it's not true, as the rumors have it, that I have permanently hired the Mormons. The Mormons are experts in genealogy, and that they have a special number that they could call me when they find this information that they supposedly are looking for, which is to find the common link between the Henry Gates family and the William Gates family. And when they find it, I'm going to be the happiest black man in the whole world. Anyway, since I have 2 minutes left, in the year 2000, a young black geneticist who taught at Howard University, his name is Dr. Rick Kittles, he called me and he said that there had been developments in DNA testing, and that they were looking for volunteers, prominent African Americans, as he put it, and to donate their blood, and that he could tell them where they were from in Africa. And I said, you can really do this, because you see, after 1977, I had one serious case of roots envy. That's the year, of course, that Alex Haley made the greatest miniseries in the history of television. And if Alex Haley could tell what tribe he was from, I wanted to be able to tell what tribe I was from. But I couldn't do it. Nobody could do it. In fact, most scholars don't think Alex Haley did it. But Alex Haley went to his grave believing that he had traced his lineage back to Africa. Rick Kittles from Howard University said he could do it. So he flew up to, at the time I was living on Francis Avenue, and he flew up and he took my blood. Now, Rick Kittles might be brilliant at genetic theory, but he's not brilliant extractor of blood. And I now realize why nobody else would let him take their blood. So finally, after about 3 months, he sent me, I kept calling him and saying, how come you haven't told me I want my Kunta Kinte moment. I want to know what tribe I'm from. And he said, because your results are so anomalous. And we had to test it over and over again. But he said, you are a Nubian. And all it means is that there's somebody walking around on the face of the earth who has my identical mitochondrial DNA, with whom we share, lots of characteristics, shall we say. And there was a Nubian person, one little person in Egypt. Now, the problem with this is that Nubia is the land that ran from Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, up to the Second Cataract, which is where the Aswan Dam is, okay? All of our ancestors came from West Africa, except for 2% that came from Mozambique. West and South Central Africa, Angola. 23% of us came from what is now Angola. None of us came from Egypt. Well, I didn't care, because all black Americans either want to be Zulu or they want to be Nubian. They want to be Zulu like Oprah Winfrey did, because the Zulus were ferocious warriors and they defeated the British for a long time until they actually lost. Or you want to be Nubians because the Nubians were the 25th dynasty in Egypt. They were the black gods and kings. They beat the pharaohs. So that's where you want. But none of us are either Nubians or none of us are Zulus. So I decided that I got up in the middle of the night one night, having gotten this news, and I decided that I could make a series that combined these two interests. The one that started when I was 10 years old, looking at my grandfather in that casket, and this new, shaky, but interesting science of ancestry tracing through DNA. That I would get 8 prominent African Americans, and I would do their family tree back to slavery. And when the paper trail ended, as inevitably it does, I would then do their DNA, their mitochondrial DNA, which you inherit from your mother, your Y DNA if you're a man, which you inherit from your father, and which never changes. It's identical. And I would do a series about that. So the next day I called Quincy Jones. Now, Quincy Jones is a very good friend of mine. Quincy Jones scored the music for Roots. And he had serious Roots envy since 1977, too. And he talked about how lucky Alex Haley was. So I said, Q, if I could do for you what Alex Haley did, would you be in my series? And he said, absolutely. Now, who's Quincy Jones' best friend? Oprah Winfrey. Now, to do a 4-hour series on PBS, you need $6 million. I knew if I could get Quincy Jones and Oprah Winfrey, that's $6 million. Be like an ATM machine descending from the thing. So I said, would you give me Quincy Oprah's secret address, or would you ask her? And he said, absolutely not. But he said, write to her at this address and use this name, because he wouldn't intervene for me. And so I did, and I didn't hear from Oprah Winfrey. I didn't know Oprah Winfrey from Eve. A week later, my cell phone rings, Quincy Jones calling. I said, Q, what's happening? A deep woman's voice said, Dr. Gates, this is Oprah Winfrey. I'd be honored to be in your... I said, thank you, Jesus. And basically, $6 million didn't just descend from the sky because everybody wanted their product, Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, and Coca-Cola, identified with the revelation of Oprah Winfrey's ancestor. But the big surprise, and then I'll conclude, was this. I sold the series, and I conceived of the series around the DNA, the relationship between identity and DNA. But as everyone, or anyone who's seen the series knows, all of my guests, I've now done 2 series and 1 on Oprah, 19 guests, they all break down and cry. I got the Mormons, and you know about the Mormons. The President of the Mormon Church in 1839 had a revelation that genealogy was fundamental to their belief system, and as a matter of fact, they believed they could baptize your dead ancestors, and that's why they have records on all you all, which you can access through Ancestry, Ancestry.com. the part that moves people, the part that made Oprah Winfrey cry and Chris Rock cry and Quincy Jones cry, was not the revelation of their ancestry as we trace it through DNA. And remember, 25% of all African American males would trace their Y DNA to Europe because of slavery. I trace both my mitochondrial DNA and my Y DNA to Europe. I'm not descended from a Nubian. The reason Dr. Rick Kittle suggested that was that there was one little match of a person at the mouth of the Nile River. When I finally got a map of my mitochondrial matches, it looked like Europe had smallpox. I am one of the few black people who's descended from a liaison between a white man and a slave woman on my father's side. Yes, and on my mother's side, a white woman and a black man, and that's encoded in my DNA. But the question I leave you with is, why was I wrong in thinking that people would care more about their Kunta Kinte moment, their Alex Haley moment, their DNA moment, than, surprise, surprise, the revelation of their African American and non-African American ancestors on this side of the Atlantic, whom we could restore to their lives through genealogy and presenting them their family tree. Thank you very much.